Too kind, too kind. I'm all embarrassed. No, thanks so much, Elizabeth. That was a lovely introduction. And I'd actually just like to start by saying how actually genuinely excited I am to be speaking here at the Moore Centre Symposium. This is because, in many ways, my professional interest in pedophilia was aided by the very people in this room, and I'll get into more of that later. Okay, one thing I'm not award-winning at is it's PowerPoint. There we go. There we go. See it proof. Okay, yeah. Unlike many of us in this room, I'm not like a researcher in the traditional sense. I'm not a policymaker and things like that. I don't work in academia. I'm a journalist, and I'm here to talk about my work covering pedophilia from my perspective, and specifically intervention, prevention, and non-offending pedophiles. And as Elizabeth pointed out, I use the term non-offending because I think many people, maybe not in this room, but the general public often fails to make a distinction between pedophilia and sexual offending. So that's why I use that terminology going forward. So in 2012, I began working on a story about young pedophiles who want help battling their attractions, which I'd spend like the next 2 years working on. I feel for those of you in here who work in academia, 2 years on a project isn't that long, but as a journalist, it's a really long time. Yeah, and by far one of the most common questions I got throughout the 2 years I was reporting this is why? And that question was really simple to answer. I'd never heard of the concept of non-offending pedophiles before, and once I did, I was really intrigued and I wanted to know more. And it's, as Elizabeth mentioned, it started off as the MA thesis at Columbia Journalism School. We had to find a topic and do a 10,000 word narrative written piece. And I was like frantically searching for what I wanted to do. Like I had never thought about pedophilia as a topic before. And kind of randomly, I was reading an article about the Jerry Sandusky Penn State situation. And this is around the time that he'd been sentenced. I'm assuming most people in this room know who he is. And if not, you should. But basically, it was all about his sentencing. At the bottom of this article, all the comments, there was an online article, was just so vitriolic. They're calling for his rape, murder, and death, which isn't incredibly surprising. But what I found interesting is that it was like across the board. I went through like 80 comments, 130 comments. Not one was just like, this is bad. It was always just really kind of vitriolic. And it reminded me how demonized pedophiles are in our society. I mean, even murderers have their letter-writing fans, you know? Like, pedophiles have no fans outside of that little group. Sorry, I make such horrible jokes. I apologize. I was speaking to someone about this before, so just, bear with me going forward. But anyway, it got me to thinking about how all this starts. I mean, Sandusky wasn't born a 65-year-old child molester. And I want to know how these feelings first formed, because in my profession, in journalism, traditionally there are two archetypes that are really often reported, and the first one is like the unrepentant serial abuser like Sandusky, who's kind of caught after remaining undetected for decades. Or we have the offender who's been caught for the crimes, spent time in prison, is now out and is trying to kind of like atone for their crimes. And they're kind of the two main things. But both of these figures are usually well past middle age. And again, I don't think people just suddenly wake up one day at 65, 55 and think, well, I'm going to go and molest some children. That actually wasn't a joke, so please don't see it as such. But what about the preceding decades? I mean, and do these men feel conflicted about their actions? Because we never really talk about that. They're immediately monsters. And what about the 40 years before that? How do these people become monsters? And more importantly, when does this sexual attraction to kids actually begin? I did some research, and as it turns out, anecdotally, it occurs in the same time that more normative desires occur, which is in adolescence and early teens. And I wondered how these individuals, who are kids themselves, essentially, come to terms with it. Because, I thought about how hard that period must be. I'm a gay guy, I'm 34. When I was a kid, and being a gay man of a certain age, when I was a kid, there weren't that many gay people on TV. Ellen hadn't come out yet, she just did. And I'm fine with it now, obviously, and it wasn't the most fraught time, but I was confused. I didn't know who to turn to, I didn't know who to tell, and that is just a drop in the bucket compared to what it must be like for someone who's attracted to children. There is no it gets better for pedophiles. And I wondered how many of these men, and sometimes women, but in my experience mainly men that I spoke with, young men, ended up committing sexual offences. And even if they did they always want to? Who could they turn to if they didn't? And so I set about finding people who could kind of give me answers. The very first person I actually spoke with was Fred Berlin, who I think he spoke today. Hey, Fred. How's it going? Um, because I was pretty green about this whole pedophilia thing. Um, and so it was during this discussion that I learned that Elizabeth was back establishing the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse, which is why it's so exciting to be here. Um, and I gave her a call, and we just got to talking about prevention. And I feel that prevention, I mean, we're all in this room to talk about it today in many regards, but at the time, and in my experience, I'd never heard the word prevention used in regards to pedophilia. It was always the prosecution of sex offenders and not prevention. And so it kind of began what would become the 2 year project that involved gaining access to a group of undetected, self identified pedophiles in their teens and early 20s and kind of learning about what life was like for them. Um, the reporting culminated in a story on This American Life and a print piece in Matter, and ultimately it posed 2 questions. The first was, could there be a better way to treat pedophiles who want help? And what can we do to help facilitate this? Between the radio and the podcast, the radio piece has been listened to, I think, between 3.5 and 4 million times. And the print piece, I think, did just as well. And to my knowledge, it's been the most read story in the site's history. And whilst my ego would love to take all the credit for this, and occasionally I let it, but not too often, I think realistically the success of these pieces has as much to do with our cultural obsession with pedophilia and sex offending. In addition to that as well, I feel that what was really interesting about these pieces is that I think the American public has read and heard a lot about child sex offenders, but they hadn't really heard from people who are attracted to kids and have not acted on it. And I think, again, this distinction between pedophilia and sexual offending, and again, many people in this room, hopefully most, understand that distinction, but trust me, judging by the feedback I got, it was a huge paradigm shift for a general audience. I mean, it even changed the way I think about pedophilia. I was guilty of using these terms interchangeably. I didn't do it intentionally or with any kind of malice. I just didn't know any better. And I certainly didn't even make that further distinction between pedophilia and situational offending, which is a very big topic I'll leave for another day. Excuse me, where am I? There we go. It was time to turn the page. And also, I discovered the extent of people's misconceptions about pedophilia, and more importantly, and I think that's something that may be interest to people in this room, it really taught me how it impacts barriers to getting help for people who genuinely want it. And so I want to talk with you today about what I learned about pedophilia, specifically as it pertains to young men and sometimes women in their teens and early 20s, public perception, and what I learned about the hurdles to accessing this help, kind of like a behind the scenes of my reporting. But first, I want to introduce you to someone I called Adam, who became the central character of my story. And the word character sounds condescending, but you have to pick people, and he's a real person, obviously. But at the moment, he's 20 years old, and he's a self-identified, non-offending pedophile. And he runs an online support group for pedophiles in their teens and early 20s who want help from battling their attractions. But his story starts much earlier than that. We first started speaking when he was 18, but his story started really when he was 16. At the time, he'd been viewing child pornography for 2 years, and it wasn't until he was 16 that he really realized what this meant for him and what he was doing, and the way he tells me this story. Because, you see, when he was 14, a lot of the kids in these videos he was watching weren't that much younger than him. It's just as he grew up, they kind of either stayed the same age or got younger, and it took him a couple of years before he really realized that something was up. And it was actually one particular video he saw where the kid was in a lot of distress. And he realized that, okay, and I think he realized, oh my God, I'm like one of those guys they speak about on the news. I'm a pedophile. And he kind of just went into, the way he describes it, into like immediate depression and anxiety, all these comorbid symptoms, which I think are pretty common when it comes to this area. And so he basically reached out to his mother and said, I want to get some therapeutic help. He didn't tell her why. He just said, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I want to see someone. His mother didn't press him and took him to see a therapist. So I'm going to play a little bit of a clip about what preceded that and what that experience was like for him. It's 4 minutes, so like sit back and relax. And is it possible to dim the lights a little bit so people don't have to look at my face the whole 4 minutes, like awkwardly? Just a smidge. I mean, you can if you want, but all right.
It was a Friday morning, very early in the day. I was her first patient. We got there even before she got there, and I was just very nervous. I knew exactly what was coming. I'd known for so long, that I was going to walk in there and what I was going to say. And I'd rehearsed it in my head.
And what was this script you'd been playing over and over in your head?
I'm a pedophile and I'm addicted to child pornography. And I remember I walked in there and we started talking. And then she kind of said, so what are you here for? And I said, well, I'm very anxious. And she said, well, why are you anxious? And my heart was beating. I'd never been so terrified in my life. But I uttered the words. I said, well, this is difficult to say, but I'm a pedophile and I'm addicted to child pornography. And I saw kind of a look of horror on her face, and she asked me to repeat that. She must have thought that she misheard me, for something like that. But I repeated it. Then immediately she went from being this very nice, gentle person to very harsh and critical.
What did she say to you?
Well, she raised her voice, telling me, this isn't okay. And, we talked about it a bit. I mentioned that, at that point I'd been, I think, 11 weeks clean of child pornography. But, I was, I was just terrified, the whole time. And, I remember she tried, talking with me about why I have these attractions, and she was obviously convinced, that, well, I had trouble talking with people my own age, so I felt less judged by younger kids, and that's why I was interested in them. And that's it's apparently a very common thing for therapists who aren't at all trained in this area to think.
So she didn't even believe that you were a pedophile, just that you couldn't kind of make it with kids your own age, essentially, yeah? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes.
And what did you say to her in response?
Oh, well, I disagreed. I said, no, I really firmly believe that's not the case, I know what I'm attracted to, and it's not like I had friends. It's not like I didn't have a single friend. I said, look, these attractions are, more intense than they are towards any adult I've ever met or seen. And I'm really confident that it's not just, being scared to talk to people my own age.
Was it kind of weird or frustrating kind of disclosing this massive thing about yourself and then having to kind of just really drive it on home and prove it to her?
Yeah, it was definitely, it was annoying. But, I'll tell you that the feeling that overcame me most the whole time was that I was being judged. That's definitely what I felt most when I left later. I considered writing an email to her apologizing for dropping, such a bombshell on her. And I saw her again.
And what happened in that second session?
So she was a little calmer. She'd obviously had some time to think about it. She basically told me, pretty much instantly, that she couldn't help me. And, she said that she'd looked around, but she couldn't really, find much. And then, within a few minutes, she asked how I'd feel if she told my mother, about what was going on. So, first, my heart obviously started beating much faster, and, I became incredibly anxious. And, I said, I really, I don't want to do that. So she left the room for a minute, then came back in with my mother.
And I sat down, and the first thing that I recall the therapist saying is, "We've got a problem."
But lucky for Adam, his mother actually was supportive, and she got him a new therapist, one who was more equipped to deal with the situation. Though at the same time, whilst Adam had more success with the second therapist, for him it wasn't really enough. He wanted to speak to people he could relate to, which I think is a very human need. And he began to reach out to other young men and women online, and eventually, for lack of something similar, had kind of inadvertently formed a support group for pedophiles, self-identified pedophiles in their teens and early 20s. I'm going to play you one more clip, and this one's a little bit briefer. In this next clip, we're given a little bit more detail about how Adam's group functions. So again, sit back, this is like 2 minutes, so not quite as long.
At 17, Adam started searching online for other guys like himself. Young men struggling to deal with their attraction to kids, and some responded. They got to talking online, and soon there were a bunch of them communicating on a daily basis. Before long, Adam realised that he had inadvertently formed a support group for young pedophiles. There are currently 9 members, ranging in age from 16 to 22, 8 men and 1 woman. They communicate in the same way that any bunch of teenagers do: G-chat, text, email, the odd phone call or video chat. And there's usually at least a few people online each night. I've talked to 5 of them, and met 3 of those in person. They all said they're glad to have found the group, and for most, it's the only outlet they have. Everyone I've spoken to has a story about how the group saved them. A 22-year-old college student told me this one.
There was a time when I was really running out of hope for the future. I felt, I was unemployed, and I felt like no one was going to give me a shot, and I felt like I had literally no shot in life, and I kind of wanted to kill myself. I didn't do it. The first thing I thought of was, especially Adam in specific, but the rest of them as well, and I couldn't let them down like that.
The governing principle of the group is that you can only be a part of it if you agree that it's wrong to have sex with kids. There are other pedophile support groups online who feel the opposite, who advocate for the abolishment of age of consent laws. Others suggest that molesting children is wrong because it's illegal, but stop short of taking a moral stand. Adam's group absolutely takes a moral stand. A few times, he's found himself trying to convince potential members of the group that having sex with children is wrong, and occasionally Adam has to turn someone away.
There was one time someone came in, and he admitted to me pretty much right away that he'd done some sexual things with a 5-year-old kid, and right then and there I said, we can't have you. First off, they're a risk, but what's more is I think that I'll admit I have a bias. I think we are better people than those who go out and hurt kids.
So now back to the reporting and the challenges that come with covering a topic like this. I mean, as I mentioned, I kind of came to the topic after reading about the Sandusky article. I spoke to Elizabeth, found out about the Moore Center, which was at that stage in its infancy, and I took it to my thesis advisor, and I'm like, I've got this fantastic story. There's this great kind of institution out of Hopkins who are doing this thing. And he's like, that's great, but that's not going to carry a 10,000-word narrative. You need to find characters. And so I'm not sure people in this room, how many people are aware of virtuous pedophiles? Can I get a show of hands, people who might be aware? Oh, sorry, virtuous pedophiles. Virtuous pedophiles? Sorry. My accent, I mumble, I speak fast. It's a triple threat. Yeah, listen faster. No. No. So basically, Virtuous Pedophiles is an online support group for pedophiles aged 18 and over, and it's run by 2 men called Ethan Edwards and Nick Devon. So I started to speak to Nick and Ethan and spoke to several members in this group, all of whom were like outwardly lovely. But the problem is they were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I wanted to speak with younger guys who were still trying to navigate this about themselves, who hadn't really found their place in the world and what this meant for them. Because I think that's a really crucial, important time. I mean, these people in the 60s, however uncomfortable with their attraction, have found some like box to put it in themselves, you know what I mean? Whereas the younger guys, most of the time, have not yet done this. And not to mention, it'd be hard to garner public sympathy for someone in their 50s or 60s, no matter how sympathetic they may be, so how virtuous, they may be. So I asked Ethan and Nick if they knew anyone younger. And about a week later, I got an email from Adam saying that he was an 18-year-old self-identified pedophile who ran this support group. And my head just exploded. Journalistically, it was like the best email you could ever get in your life. But it wasn't smooth sailing from that point forward. I mean, I had to navigate the ethics and legal implications of reporting a topic like this. Now, I've been a journalist for 9 years, and this is the first time I've tackled this particular area. And I'm also Australian. And so, as you can tell, I imagine. Um, and I feel that the US state laws are a little bit to wrap your head around, which I think many people in this room, certainly the policymakers in this room, can probably empathize with. Um, but once I got a handle on my legal responsibilities in terms of mandated reporting, the next question was ethics. I mean, journalistic ethics are one thing, like how to verify information, especially with a population who are so good at like kind of hiding who they are. But that's not insurmountable. But what should I do if I found out that Adam or someone in his group was actively molesting a child? In most of the states I reported in, I wasn't a mandated reporter, so it became more of a personal ethical decision versus a legal one. I spoke with an ethics professor at Columbia, and we agreed that the best plan going forward was to inform everyone I spoke with not to disclose current illegal activity if it were to come up, to avoid putting both of us in an ethically problematic spot, which was really hard. I mean, I'm a journalist, and not to be too grandiose, but my job is to get to the truth of the matter, so to tell somebody, tell me the truth, but just leave a little bit out if it ever comes to it. I mean, it's kind of like hard, and I think it speaks to a larger truth, which shows how uncharted this territory is, like how many things are in the way of us having open dialogue in these areas. And then another more practical challenges. In order to tell this story, I needed to build trust. And what I found really fascinating is that Adam and two others in the group who I spoke with, one was studying to become a preschool teacher. The other actually had offended when he was 17. He offended against a 12-year-old. And it was really interesting because these guys were so desperate to tell their story, yet they were so afraid of being exposed, which is very understandable. And so I had to basically build their trust, which involved like countless hours, like literally hundreds of hours of like pre-interviewing on GChat and calling before I flew out to meet them. But then when I got there, the floodgates just opened. And most of these guys had spoken to other self-identified pedophiles, but they had never, with the exception of Adam, spoken to someone who didn't identify in that way, who didn't judge them. And so they were so hungry to get this information out there. I remember the preschool teacher I was speaking with, who was very lovely and sweet. We were speaking one stage for like, I think it was like the third or fourth hour in his car in a mall parking lot, just interviewing him. And I was like, oh, hour 4, I'm so tired, and so much transcription to go. And I had days to interview him. So I said, like, maybe we should just like call it quits tonight. We're pretty tired, and we'll pick it up again in the morning. And he turned to me very uncharacteristically and very aggressive. I just need to get this out. And it just really showed to me just like how hungry these guys are to tell people what their experiences are like. And another thing as well, I feel as well that like we all work in different areas. Some people have direct contact with these people or potentially offenders. Other times we think about it like one step removed. And I remember speaking to Adam, and I know he's listening, and I apologize, Adam. But he's a very smart guy, and I have a huge amount of respect for him. And he was very good at speaking about the ideology behind being attracted to children, things kind of far removed. And I asked all those questions, but I was actually curious about the physicality of a child. Like, what about a child is the most appealing to you? Because I don't think we often hear about that either, because it can be kind of icky, really icky. And I'd heard some horrific things during my reporting, not just from Adam, but other people discussing child pornography and what that looked like for them. And sitting next to Adam again in the car after I'd been pressuring him to tell me this one detail, and he wouldn't look me in the eye. He just seemed so deeply ashamed, and he just said, "I'm just attracted to like small genitalia and small hairless limbs." And for some reason, that was so simple, and by comparison to what I'd heard, it was like nothing. But it just really hit me. Like, this isn't just like me talking about pedophilia randomly. I'm speaking to a young guy who is dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, and he's very, very ashamed. This made it hard to keep an emotional distance, something that's pretty critical, but I try to get around that. Just checking for time. We're good for time? Great. Then the next issue was basically how to get someone to let me tell this story. I mean, I've written as a thesis, but how do I get it published? And it was pretty hard. I mean, people were like, this story is amazing, this is fantastic, we can't run it. It brings up a really crucial question, which is like, these people need help, and like, by not publishing stuff, we're kind of adding to that inability for them to kind of get help and open a more open dialogue with society, but we can't publish it. I took pictures to This American Life, and it was initially rejected. That was more because we were throwing up the idea that these young men really want help. It's really hard for them to access help, and at the moment it looks like they're not going to get help. So in terms of a story narrative, it was just like, just as grim as it gets. And so I was rejected, but then there was a story twist. I actually ended up introducing some of the young men to Elizabeth, and she started speaking with them. And one of them, Adam, is actually consulting on a project I think she's going to speak about after I talk. And so I kind of rang up This American Life, my producer Robin Semyon, who's, God, she's so amazing. And I said, look, I know it's been rejected, but like I've got this one little kind of thing that's happened, and maybe it's something. And she took it back to the group. They have a pitch meeting once every fortnight, and it got through because it had like a tiny little glimmer of hope, which I think is really important, not just for me getting my stuff published, but also for like all of our industries and fields that we work in. Just kind of like trying to wedge little potentials for change and help. And then there was also actually how is it going to be received once it is published? And I had a bit of a preview as to what that may be because during the years of reporting, I'd have run-ins with like friends and things like that, and you'd have these discussions, and they'd be like really into it, and then you speak to them for hours, sometimes over dinner, about what you were doing, what it meant. They're like, "That's really interesting. These poor guys. That makes so much sense." But you've got to think about the kids, and I'm like, "Do we not just speak for the past 2.5 hours? Like, yeah, of course we're thinking about the kids, but." If we want to reduce the incidence of child sexual abuse, I mean, maybe it wouldn't hurt to like speak to those who are potentially most likely to abuse them. Yeah, I get that, but you've just got to think of the kids. Like it happened a lot, and beyond these little personal anecdotes of frustrating dinner conversations, it just really reminded me again like how big an issue this is for a lot of people, and not just people who are survivors of child sexual assault, which is something to certainly consider. But people just have these walls up, and some people just either won't or can't listen. Although once it aired, the response I cared the most about were the people in the story. And for Adam and some of the others who appeared, I think it was really hard because they were for the first time seeing themselves out there as like 3D figures. And it involved like discussing maybe them looking at child pornography. And it involved all that stuff, things that make them look like monsters. Adam initially was very upset, and I just had to kind of really explain to him that it's really important for people to understand what it was like for you. You were 16. You weren't really, in my mind, at fault. And once you realized, you tried your very best to stop it in an environment where you didn't have any other help. So you're a 16-year-old who starts an online support group of pedophiles. It's just, it's mind-boggling. It's insane. And the public feedback, to my shock, was overwhelmingly positive. I think I was actually speaking to my producer, Robin, from This American Life the other day, and we were talking about this, and she said, I think it was like 90% of feedback was incredibly overwhelmingly positive. And same for the matter piece, the print piece. The general public kind of got in contact and basically said, well, just thanks. I didn't really realize these people existed. I thought pedophiles were monsters. I thought they all wanted to abuse children. Like, I've just never heard about this before. A lot of people who are minor attracted reached out and asked for help. And the one that really made me happy was, again, a lot of survivors of CSA reached out and said, whilst these pieces were hard to hear and read, they're really thankful that someone was tackling this from a more solution-based perspective, which made me super happy. And it was covered in the US, in France, Mexico, the Netherlands. And again, like I'm not doing this big ego stroke, but I think it really shows when you manage to get this perspective on the table, people are hungry to talk about it, which I think is it's not just me. There are other journalists who have done this, but it's only been in the past 3 to 5 years. This has kind of been the narrative in the media has been changing to allow for this. Okay, I'm going to wrap things up, but I kind of want to just kind of like again impress upon you like what these boys have done in this particular instance is remarkable. Again, Adam created this group because there was nothing really available for him like this. And people tell me that I was brave to do this story, which I don't really buy. I think it's a bit bullshit because I'm a journalist and it's a compelling story. And so I'm really thankful. And again, I know you're listening, Adam. Thanks again. I've said it a million times. But I think I'm just so appreciative of their trust in me. And it's just been a huge luxury as a journalist. But my biggest takeaway is they really want help. Many of these young men and women really want help. And many people in this audience really want to help. In our own ways, and I think there's like a wall preventing some of this help, and it's comprised of certain parts. One part is mandated reporting, and I don't have an answer, and I don't want to diminish mandated reporting because it's brought countless instances of child sexual abuse and neglect to light. I don't have an answer, but I think we need to keep talking about what we can do to help kind of bridge these like gaps and have people who want help and want to talk, make them able to do that. I'm going to finish up, but and I've done this versions of this talk a couple of times, and I keep saying this, not because I'm lazy, but because, maybe a little bit, But because it's important. I mean, I said at the beginning, I'm a journalist. I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. I'm not a policymaker. And many people in this audience are, or they're students in grad school who are training to be. And I think I want to leave you with one question, which is I want you to leave here thinking, like, what can I do within my profession to kind of, like, help these young men who want to try and prevent sex offenders? And beyond that, I think moving forward, think about the ways in which all of us who are invested and interested in this area, in our various different fields, like how we can work together to make sure our individual work is as impactful as possible. And I really think going forward, just the more dialogue we can have about this topic is the greater chance we can help people who are minor attracted and also help their potential victims. So that's it.